This is MidAtlantic Women in Agriculture's Wednesday webinar, What You Need to Know About Food Safety Modernization Act. Our presenter today is Justine, a GAP educator with the University of Maryland. A special thank you to our sponsors, MidAtlantic Farm Credit, Delaware Department of Agriculture, and the USDA, along with all of our gold and silver level sponsors. This presentation, along with all archived presentations, can be found at our website. Thank you for listening.
As Victoria said, I am the GAP educator here at the University of Maryland. I've been doing this for about a year and a half, and at the end of last year, when the produce rule rolled out, it was kind of a shift in gears for me personally and also for the state. Luckily, Maryland is in really good shape for rolling out the produce rule because we've been doing our GAPS program for so long, and I'll be talking about that in a bit. But today I'm just going to try to use the next 45 minutes to talk about what the Food Safety Modernization Act really means for farmers, trying to get more at the practical side of this rule. So the act itself was passed in late 2010. Basically, the FDA now has a legislative mandate requiring this prevention-based control across the food supply. And this is simply because there were a lot of foodborne illnesses happening each year, and FDA wanted to take a more proactive approach to the foodborne illnesses and fighting the foodborne illnesses. So all in all, there are 12 finalized rules. One is still proposed, and then one is, this is taken directly from their website, Advanced Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. Looking through them, I think there are 4 that directly affect producers. There's the produce rule, which I'm going to talk about today. There's also the preventive controls for human food, the preventive controls for animal food, and then most recently the sanitary transportation of human and animal food. Okay, like I said, we're focusing on the produce rule. This was passed late 2015, really similar to GAPS, and for those of you who don't know what GAPS is, it's good agricultural practices. It's a voluntary program that the USDA does on a national level, but Maryland is one of only 2 states in the entire country that has a state GAPS program. Massachusetts is the other one. When we teach our GAPS classes, we focus on the 4 W's, we call them, and that's waste, wildlife, water, and worker training. Although they're not called the 4 W's in the FDA-approved curriculum that was created by the Produce Safety Alliance up at Cornell, they are the same concepts. Biggest differences being with water tests and more record keeping, and I'll get into that a bit more in this presentation. But like I said, Maryland is in really great shape to roll this out simply because we've been doing these GAP trainings, I believe, since 2008. And many of you might have attended some of these trainings. So right off the bat, I'm going to get into the exclusions and exemptions. There are some key words that you should know for the produce rule. There's exclusions, there's exemptions. There's what they call a raw agricultural commodity. So some growers are going to be excluded based on what they're growing. If what you're growing is rarely consumed raw, and I have a list coming up later, then you can be excluded. And if your average annual produce sales are below $25,000 a year, you can be excluded. You can be exempt if you have a processing activity later down the line that includes a kill step, and by kill step I mean something like cooking where any sort of pathogenic microbes would be killed, or if your average annual food sales, and that's not produce sales, that's food sales, is over $500,000 to what they're calling qualified end users. That's all very confusing, and there's certainly much more to the exemption part of it. I'm saving that for the end because I think it's really important for everyone to pay attention to what these next few slides are going to say, simply because produce safety is important, and there are all these little loopholes here and there, but depending on who you're selling to and what sort of support you want from folks at the MDA, you should really try to observe a lot of these rules that I'm about to talk about. Okay. So there are a lot of words on this slide, but you guys can download this presentation and refer back to this particular one in the future. It's simply a list of the produce that is covered by the produce rule. So most of these things you'll see are normally consumed raw, and then this next slide, this is the list that's considered rarely consumed raw. It's not covered by the produce rule. Okay, so when the Produce Safety Alliance does their training, or when one of the trainers that they've trained does a training, there are 6 sections that they'll go into. The first is worker health, hygiene, and training. The second is soil amendments. Third is wildlife, domesticated animals, and land use. Then they've got 2 sections on agricultural water, the first being on the production water, which is, everything that happens in the growing phase. And then they've got post-harvest water. And then lastly, we have post-harvest handling and sanitation. In terms of worker health, hygiene, and training, really they just want to see that folks are being trained in a way that is specific to their particular task with a food safety flavor to it. Teaching your workers, including yourselves, how to recognize specific symptoms of an illness, letting them know who they should be reporting the injuries or illnesses to, keeping records of when these trainings are happening, when illnesses are happening, having a procedure in place for what workers are allowed to do when and if they are sick, keeping bathroom and hand washing facilities clean and in a proper location. I think according to OSHA standards, there's a certain distance that you have to keep between workers and bathrooms. And then, like I said before, training records are important. In terms of resources for worker health, hygiene, and training, when and if you do go to a PSA Grower Training, we give out this wonderful binder that is just full of information. The pieces of paper in it are also full of other links to resources that you can go to, scientific papers that you can get your hands on. There's just so much information out there. Of course, there's the Cornell signage and training DVDs that we give out at our GAP trainings. Because GAP is so similar, a lot of these can be used for the same purposes. If you aren't able to get to a GAP trainings, the Cornell website has all of these for sale. So that's a great resource there. In terms of soil amendments, really they're talking about manure versus compost, knowing the differences between those two, knowing how to properly compost and keep records of composting. There is a tricky part of it called this minimum application interval. There's technically nothing in the FSMA Produce Safety Rule yet outlining what that application interval should be. They were sort of waiting for more research to come out, but for now they're sort of saying that the national organic standards are what they're going to go with. For untreated soil amendments, that's sort of like raw manure, anything that hasn't been composted. They're saying that between application and harvest there should be 120 days. If it's coming into contact, if the edible portion of the crop is coming into contact with the untreated soil amendment, and then it's 90 days if it's not coming into contact. And then there at the bottom for the treated soil amendments, the composted soil amendments, that's a 0-day application interval. That's whether or not it's touching the compost. That's the big one for the soil amendments, I think. And resources for that, again, this grower training manual has a ton. They provide a list of which soil amendments are acceptable. They tell you exactly what records you'll need to have. They have a reminder of what those application intervals are, and then approved soil amendment treatment protocols. Thirdly, the wildlife, domesticated animals, and land use. This is mainly for those of you growing in an outdoor area, so not in a greenhouse. But I mean, pests are everywhere, so it's important for both. You're mainly conducting pre-harvest risk assessments of your fields, though. You're looking for wildlife. You're looking for tracks, fecal matter in the field, any sort of evidence of crop destruction. You're doing these risk assessments, and then you should have some sort of a plan in place for harvesting your crop safely. For example, if you do see fecal matter in the field, are you going to harvest 2 feet around that fecal matter, or what is the plan? Okay, ag water. This is the biggie. There are a lot of water tests involved in this, as some of you may have heard, but I'm going to take you through it, and hopefully we can get it figured out. For production water, there are 3 things that we really look at with production water, and that's the source and quality, the application method, and then the timing of the application, and I'll explain why. Well, let me go back. So production, water source, and quality, the amount of risk that you assume will depend on your water source. So if you're using, a surface water like a pond, that's going to be more risky than if you were using groundwater, like well water, versus, something that's most likely even safer if you're using municipal water. The application method, thinking about drip irrigation versus overhead irrigation, and then the timing of application, I'll get into in a sec. So the way that they want us to figure out the quality of our water is by creating these microbial water quality profiles. They want us to do this for several reasons. They're thinking that by taking these tests over a period of time can help you understand the long-term quality of your water source. And if you determine that the quality of your water isn't always that great, or maybe you have a source of water that's really, really clean, that might affect your decisions about what you want to use that water for. Are you going to use it on something that's covered under the produce rule, like spinach? And maybe if you have a water source that's not as great, you might use that for something like your sweet corn, which isn't covered by the produce rule. So understanding the appropriate uses for each source, and then once you get a good feel for the quality of water that you have, you can figure out whether or not you need to take any corrective measures. And I'll explain what I mean by corrective measures in a sec. Okay, so here are the actual water quality criteria for the water used during growing activities. So this production water category. There are 2 calculations. There's something called the geometric mean, and that's that 126 or less CFUs per 100 mils of water. The geometric mean is really just a forgiving average. You're taking the average, but it's the average not of the raw numbers, but of the logarithms of those numbers. So it's pretty forgiving. And then the statistical threshold value, they want to see 410 or less CFUs generic E. coli per 100 mils of water. And that's just measuring the variance or the sort of the span of differences between your different water test results. So two data points. Okay, to create the microbial water quality profile, the testing requirement will differ depending on the source. So if you're using a public water system, all you need to do is get a copy of a certificate of compliance from them. If you're using groundwater, like a well, they want 4 or more tests during the growing season or over the course of a year, and then just 1 more time in each subsequent year. And if you're using surface water, which, as I said before, is a bit more risky, they want you to do 20 or more tests over 2 to 4 years. So if you think about that, if you're doing the tests as fast as you possibly can, that's going to be 10 tests in 2 years or up to 5 tests each year for 4 years. and then 5 or more times each year. So if you're doing the minimum there, it would be 5 water tests each year, and that's going to be per surface water source that you are using. Now, one thing I want to mention, do I have it in here? I don't have it in here. It's really important to mention is that currently drip line irrigation is not being regulated by the produce rule. So if you are using drip line and it's not for a raw agricultural commodity that's grown in the ground like a carrot or an onion, you do not have to do this microbial water quality profile. If you're using overhead irrigation, you do. I hope that makes sense. And I can say it again at the end of the presentation as well. So profile samples must be representative of use and must be collected as close in time as practicable to, but before harvest. So, you know, for example, if you have 2 fields right next to each other and you're growing sweet corn in the top field and you're growing cantaloupes in the bottom field. Well, cantaloupes are covered by the produce rule. That's an item that's normally consumed raw, whereas sweet corn is not covered. If your water source is a pond and it's going into your sweet corn field before it travels down through your cantaloupe field, it might make more sense to sample the water in your cantaloupe field than it would sampling it at the beginning of the sweet corn field, because that water is traveling through that whole sweet corn field before it even reaches your covered produce. So that's what they mean when they talk about representative of use. And in addition, you know, it might not be the best idea to be collecting those water samples in October, November, December. It might make more sense to do it in the spring or summer, because that's when you're going to be using the water. So that's all that means. Okay, corrective measures. This is what I was talking about earlier in terms of the timing of the application. If you're using overhead irrigation and you need to take these water tests, let's say you've taken all the water tests that you need to do, you've calculated your geometric mean and your statistical threshold value, let's say you don't meet the criteria. The amount of generic E. coli in your water is simply just too high. There are corrective measures that you can take. The first one is to apply a time interval for what they're calling microbial die-off. And that's based on this logic that out there in the field, because of things like UV radiation from the sun, drying out from, you know, just being outside, competition with other microbes, things of that nature, fluctuating temperatures, those pesky pathogens that we're so worried about, their population is going to plummet in a matter of days. So their thinking is that if you apply a time interval between the last time that you water your crop and when you harvest it, you would be good. There are online calculators that can be used, and I think I might have included that here, but if I didn't, I'll make sure either Shannon or Victoria emails you links for this. But there are online calculators that you can use to calculate the geometric mean and the statistical threshold value. There are apps that you can download. There's also a really helpful, if you want to just calculate it by hand, you can do that. That calculation is in the PSA Grower Training manual that you would get if you went to a training. But those calculators include this microbial die-off rate. They'll say, hey, did you meet the standard? If you didn't, hey, if you observe this 3-day minimum or 1-day minimum, they'll calculate that number of days for you, then you're good. Now, if the water quality is so bad that you would need more than 4 days for that level to drop down to below the threshold, then you would not be able to take advantage of that microbial die-off rate. But the water would have to be pretty darn bad. So I think that's definitely an option that most people will be able to take advantage of. Reinspecting the water system, you know, if you are doing water tests and all of a sudden you get a really high number, it's different than all your other results, maybe just go out and take a look. Is there something in the pond that shouldn't be there? Was there a tipped over porta potty somewhere? Was there a big summer storm that just came through and, put a lot of runoff into your pond? Just being aware of what's going on, identifying problems, making some changes, cleaning things up, maybe waiting a bit, retest, and see if that fixes it. And then lastly, there's treating the water. There are some options out there for growers to use, and treating the water, waiting, and then testing and seeing if that helps. Okay, so post-harvest water. We focus on this just because, post-harvest water is a great way to spread contamination in your packing house, especially if you're using something like a dump tank, or if you've got a food contact surface that's every produce item is touching as it goes through. It's a great way to spread it around. So for the water that you're using in harvest and post-harvest activities, the numbers that you need for that are 0 or no detectable generic E. coli per 100 ml sample. That's for water that's coming into direct contact with covered produce. If it's coming into contact with a food contact surface, if you're using it to make ice that's going to touch the produce, and also if you're using it for hand washing. One note I added down there in bold because it's really important: you are not allowed to use untreated surface water for this activity. Okay. The testing requirements for post-harvest water are actually the same as they were for the production water. You'll notice that public water supply here, it says you just need a copy of test results or current certificate of compliance. And then for groundwater, it's that 4 or more times during the growing season or over the period of year, and then 1 more test each year after that. You don't see the untreated surface water on here, and again, that's simply because you are not allowed to use the surface water for any sort of post-harvest use. Okay, so that was a lot. This is kind of a breakdown of all of the different things that you need for the water section. Every season you need to be inspecting your water system. And by every season, I mean every year. You should look at the nature of your water source. Have you changed anything? Are you switching from a pond to a well? Are you switching from overhead irrigation to drip irrigation? What is the extent of your control over the water source? Are you sharing it with any neighbors? Maybe you could combine some of these testing requirements so both of you or all 3 of you or whoever aren't doing 20 tests over 4 years 3 separate times. Share the load. What is the degree of protection that you can use for each water source? Is there anything you can do to reduce risk with those water sources? What are the odds that that water is going to become contaminated? Do you have a poultry house nearby? Do you have Is your pond between 2 wooded areas and, attraction for deer perhaps? Are there any maintenance or repairs that you can do that would improve the water quality? In terms of record keeping, they want you to keep records of those annual inspections, basically just keeping a record of everything I just mentioned on the top half of the slide. Obviously, they want those water tests. If you are going to do something like using a specific water treatment method, just make sure you have your reasons for doing that written down. If it is based on a particular scientific journal or some other tests that you've done yourself or with help of University of Maryland Extension, just have a record of that. If you are treating your water, include the monitoring results from that. And then if you're observing a microbial die-off rate, just some sort of evidence for why you're doing that. Lots of records. Resources for the water section. Like I said before, this part is the toughest and the most different from GAPS. I did include a link there, okay. That's from the Western Center for Food Safety at UC Davis, that link right there. those 3 links right there for the Excel spreadsheet, the Ag Water app out of the University of Arizona, and then the University of Arizona also has an online calculator. I've played around with all 3 of them. They each have their own advantages and disadvantages. I prefer using the spreadsheet. It's something that you can download to your own computer and just have it there and use it whenever you need to and save it. And if you're familiar with things like Dropbox or Box or Google Drive, you can also keep it online and access it from anywhere. The AgWater app is good, but out of the University of Arizona, but it's you have to create a username and login stuff, and you do need to have a smartphone. I don't find it to be particularly user-friendly, although it's been about a year since I've played with it. Maybe they've made some changes. With the online calculator out of the University of Arizona, that one, if I'm remembering correctly, you have to enter, there's no way to save any of the data unless you download it. So you have to basically have all of your test results together, enter it all at once, and then do your calculation. It's not like, you can keep going in and updating it as you do the water test. It's kind of a one and done sort of thing. The Produce Safety Alliance, those folks up at Cornell who designed the curriculum for everything, they're working on their own by hand calculator for folks who maybe don't feel as comfortable using these spreadsheets or these apps. So look for that coming out soon. Also, the PSA website, I should have included a link for that, but if you just do a Google search for PSA Cornell, it'll come up, probably the top hit. They've got a lot of really great resources on their website. I included, I think it's 2 slides here, different water testing labs in the state, and I believe there's one in Delaware as well. So take advantage of those there. For post-harvest sanitation and handling, they want to see that you're keeping covered produce separate from non-covered produce. So, if you're packing potatoes, but you're also packing cantaloupe, making sure that those aren't coming into contact with one another. They don't want you to distribute any drops. They want you to be using food packing and packaging materials that are either cleanable or single-use. You can also use plastic liners if you like to reuse cardboard boxes. They want to see that tools and equipment are cleanable, working properly, and stored in such a way as to prevent contamination. They want to see that you're doing inspections of these tools and equipment regularly and, keeping a record of that. And then keeping a record of when you're cleaning and sanitizing those tools and equipment as well. They want to see that you're taking measures to control pests in some way, shape, or form, whether that be just paying someone to come in and having a record of when they do that and what their results are, or just writing about what you're doing yourself. They want to see records of dates and methods of cleaning and sanitizing. Okay, so those were the 5 different sections. Interestingly enough, the produce rule does not require that people have a food safety plan the way GAPs do. I suggest that people go ahead and create one anyway, just to help sort out through all of these different records and just get everything down, get it right in your mind and get it out on paper, so it's just a really great living document that you can refer to in case you forget, or if you need to use it to show to a visitor or to show to an auditor or training new workers. It's just a really great resource to have. But I did want to mention that it's not actually required by the produce rule. Okay, now getting into the hairy details of compliance, and then we'll get into those exclusions and exemptions I alluded to at the beginning of the presentation. The compliance date is going to depend on the size of your business. So if you're a very small, quote unquote, very small business, and they're defining that as 25K and between 25K and 250K in produce sales annually, and that is a 3-year average. You have 4 years from the start of the final rule date, which was January of 2016. If you're small, which is between 250 and 500K in produce sales, you've got 3 years. And if you're bigger than that, you've got 2 years. And then they're giving everybody an extra 2 years to start their water testing. That's not finish the water testing, it's just get started on the water testing. So you can see that for those farms that are making over $500,000 worth of produce sales in a year, 2 years from 2016 is next January, which means that because one of the stipulations of complying with the produce rule is attending an FDA-approved curriculum, like the PSA training that I've been mentioning, it's going to be a good idea to try to get to that training this year if you're in that all other farms category. And we have some training dates coming up that I'll mention at the end of this presentation. So if you're small or you're very small, you've got a little bit more time. I would recommend going to a training sooner rather than later, just so you can get a good feel for what this rule is saying, and also we've got a great price for the trainings this year that I'm not positive we'll be able to continue for more than a few years, but that remains to be seen. Okay. So who is this going to apply to? Well, I talked about those exclusions earlier. If you're not growing something that's considered a raw agricultural commodity, something that's not normally consumed raw, then you're excluded. If you're making more than $500,000 in annual produce sales of commodities that are intended to be eaten raw, you are absolutely covered by this rule, it means that you have to comply with this rule. If you're under $25,000 in annual produce sales, then you are not covered by this rule. The tricky part is when you fall in that in-between category, between $25,000 worth of produce sales and $500,000 worth of produce sales. That's when we get into this qualified exemptions category. So bear with me during this slide, and you can refer back to it anytime you need to if you download the presentation. But here's the deal. If more than half of the average annual monetary value of the food sales on the farm is directly to qualified end users, and they're defining qualified end users as customers and restaurants or grocery stores that are either in the same state or within 275 miles from the farm, and you're earning less than $500,000 in food sales in a year, you can be eligible for this qualified exemption. Now that's a lot. There's a lot to unpack there, but just keep in mind that you have to meet both of those requirements in order to qualify. Now, does this mean that you are excluded from the rule? No, you're still covered by the rule, but you can apply for this qualified exemption. And to do that, I'm under the impression right now that you'll have to apply for the qualified exemption. You'll have to demonstrate that your food sales are less than $500,000 a year, and you'll have to demonstrate that over half of your sale, at least over half of your sales, are going to the customers and the grocery stores and restaurants. And then you will have to put labels on what you're selling that have your farm name and address on them. So it's very complicated, but it does exist. Let me see what I have on this. Yeah, okay. We are advising growers in Maryland to try not to pay too much attention to this qualified exemption right now. The FDA is playing their cards very close to their chests. They're struggling to answer all of the many questions that are being asked right now in terms of different what if situations, and so guidance is scarce right now. So we want Maryland growers to learn about the rule, not worried about the qualified exemptions so much because it could change if there is some sort of an outbreak that happens, this qualified exemption can be taken away very easily, and we really want Maryland producers to be in compliance with the rule. And I'll get into that a bit more at the end of the presentation. I included this flow chart. The FDA has their own flow chart, and it's perfectly fine. You can find it on their website. I'm a big fan of this one out of Penn State. It's a bit simpler, but it will take you through whether or not you need to comply. We still are waiting on guidance about what actually constitutes a food sale. We do know that grain that's going to be used for feed is considered a food sale, but we're still waiting for clarification about things such as, a lot of corn is sold for food, but a lot of corn is also sold for ethanol, and oftentimes farmers don't necessarily know what their corn is going to be used for. So, there's still some stuff up in the air that might gum up whether or not you're able to use this flowchart effectively. But for now, this is what we have. Take a look. The Penn State Food Safety website also has a lot of great resources. And if you're doing any processing and you're wondering about the preventive controls rule of FSMA, they've got a flowchart just like this one on their website that you can take a look at as well. Okay, now the good news. Our own Maryland Department of Ag was awarded a NASDA grant from the FDA. It was quite a good bit of money, and it's going to help us roll out produce rule trainings and help everybody comply and get the resources that they need. It's a cooperative agreement where we can take charge, or MDA can take charge of the produce rule implementation in Maryland rather than the FDA doing it. There is going to be a farm inventory. There are going to be what they're calling these pre-evaluations, where we're basically doing like a mock audit on farms, and then later down the line there will be the actual inspections. So by getting this grant from the FDA, basically the MDA was able to negotiate that MDA would be the ones doing these mock audits, these pre-evaluations and these inspections rather than the FDA. So MDA is going to be working closely with the University of Maryland, myself, and then the University of Maryland Extension to do the education side of these inspections. So the pre-evaluations and the mock audits and everything like that, we're basically going to be walking you through how to comply. On an extremely personal level, we can come to your farm and look at very specific things and those what-if scenarios. In addition, the USDA awarded a grant to Dr. Rohan Tukekar over in food science and myself to supplement costs for a combined produce rule and preventive controls rule training. And so that is where these trainings came about. We do have 3 coming up, and I know that the fact that they are 4 days long has both alarmed and surprised a lot of people. But I want to explain that they're 4 days because they're combined trainings. The first day is for the produce safety training that I've been talking about with you this afternoon. The remaining 3 days are for the preventive controls rule. Now you can come to one, you can come to both, it's up to you. But like I said, the produce safety training is only that first day. So February 8th, February 22nd, and March 8th. They're all Wednesdays. The first one's in Cockeysville, the second one's in Queenstown at the Y, and then the third one's in Keedysville over there in Western Maryland. And there is an agenda out there. If you're interested in seeing it, just shoot me an email. It's a long day. It's 7:30 to 5 o'clock, I believe, but that's basically straight out of the Produce Safety Alliance template. I've been told by people who have led trainings already that they're on average taking between 6 to 8 hours. So while it's going to be a long day, I'm hoping it won't be as long as the agenda suggests, but we shall see. I have not led one of these trainings yet, but I have been to the PSA Train the Trainer. I've been pretty well versed in this stuff, so I'm hoping that these trainings will go really well. And I'll be assisted by Dr. Rohan Tekekar, of course, but also Dave Martin, and I believe Shauna Henley will be able to attend some of these as well. So as I said before, we've got great prices for the trainings. Because of the grant, we're able to cover the costs of the training materials and the certificates. We aren't able to cover costs of meals, though, which is why we're still charging $20 for the produce safety training, $40 for the preventive controls rule, and if you want to do both, we're going to charge $50. There is a link, a Google Forms link out there in the ether floating around that people are clicking on. That had to be closed, unfortunately, because we were approaching capacity for those trainings. But it is not completely full yet, and different trainings have more availability than others. So just shoot an email to either myself or Rohan if you do want to register, and we'll get it sorted for you. Other resources, there's me. There's my email address and my phone number. Call me anytime. Your local extension agents, they are also new to this produce rule, so I'm not going to throw them under the bus and tell you guys that they know everything there is to know about it. But with this grant money, we are hoping to do sort of a train the trainer event sometime, either this year or the next, for extension agents across the state. So they will be learning more about it and at least be able to point you in the right direction.
Thank you for watching our archived presentation of our Wednesday webinar. If you would like to see more archived Wednesday webinars, please visit our YouTube channel, or to find a schedule of upcoming live webinars, visit our website.